The frost on the Great Plains killed quietly, without warning or loud noises, penetrating even the smallest cracks in poorly constructed huts. When the temperature outside dropped to -50 degrees Fahrenheit, an ordinary night turned into a test of survival for the whole family. Death from hypothermia and sleep was so common that settlers developed a whole code of rules for preparing for bed. It was not just a routine, but a complex system of engineering and household solutions, where every mistake could cost a life. The pioneers had no central heating, modern insulation, or synthetic sleeping bags capable of retaining heat. Their arsenal consisted of straw, heated stones, bison hides, and a unique bed design that functioned like a thermos. The history of the conquest of the Wild West usually focuses on shootouts and the gold rush, forgetting that man's main enemy was the cold. The nighttime cold showed no mercy to experienced trappers or families wintering on the prairie for the first time. Watch the video to the end to find out how a common potato could save your toes from frostbite and why beds were never placed in the corner of a room. What if I told you that salvation from the deadly cold lay not in fire, but in ordinary damp earth? In the treeless expanses of Nebraska and Dakota, pioneers faced a shortage of wood, forcing them to build houses out of sod. These dwellings, contemptuously called earth houses, had unique thermal insulation properties that were unavailable to classic wooden log cabins. Walls nearly a meter thick, made of dense pieces of sod, acted as a powerful thermal buffer. The earthen wall had enormous inertia, slowly accumulating heat during the day and extremely reluctantly giving it up at night. Even when a blizzard raged outside and the temperature dropped to critical levels, a stable microclimate was maintained inside the turf house. The earth smoothed out sharp temperature fluctuations, preventing the room from freezing instantly, even if the hearth went out. This was a fundamental difference from plank buildings, which cooled down literally an hour after the stove went out. There were never any drafts inside such a structure, as the tightly laid turf had no gaps, unlike poorly fitted logs. However, there was a downside to this: dampness, which permeated everything in the house. To combat the humidity, the walls were often whitewashed with lime or covered with old canvas tarpaulins from wagons. This created an additional air layer that acted as another layer of insulation. Interestingly, the floors in such houses also often remained earthen, but they were tamped down to the consistency of stone. Unlike boards with gaps, the tamped earth did not allow the icy air from under the floor to pass through. The pioneers quickly realized that contact with the ground provided more warmth than drafty wooden flooring. Woven mats made of rags or skins were laid on the floor, creating a barrier between the feet and the cold ground. The windows in such houses were made tiny and were often located on the south side. The small area of glazing minimized the loss of precious heat through thin glass or oiled paper. At night, the windows were closed with heavy shutters or covered with thick blankets to create an airtight cocoon. Any cracks that let in cold air were carefully sealed with moss or clay before dusk. The ceiling of a turf house was also a layered cake of poles, brushwood, and a thick layer of earth. This heavy roof not only protected from the wind, but also retained warm air, which, rising upward, did not escape into the atmosphere. Snow that fell on the roof was not cleared away, as it served as an additional, natural layer of insulation. It was in such earthen fortresses that families could survive blizzards that lasted for several days. The fire in the hearth was kept to a minimum, saving scarce fuel and relying mainly on the heat-saving properties of the walls. People inside such a house felt as if they were in a burrow, protected from the fury of the elements by the thickness of the earth. In wooden houses, they had to resort to the tactic of snow blocking, throwing snowdrifts directly onto the walls from the outside. Snow, being a porous material, retained air well and created an outer coat for the house. The higher the snowdrift around the walls, the warmer it was inside, contrary to the intuitive desire to clear the space. The architecture of survival dictated its harsh conditions, where aesthetics gave way to pure functionality. Surviving at -50 degrees was only possible by turning your house into a kind of thermos. Pioneers learned to use the disadvantages of the landscape, turning soil and snow into their allies. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about living in a house made literally out of dirt and grass? Write about it in the comments. Want to know the secret that turned an ordinary bed into an impregnable fortress of warmth? A bed on the frontier was not just a piece of furniture for rest, it was the main tool for nighttime survival. Its design and location in the room were carefully thought out to minimize heat loss. Beds were never placed close to exterior walls, which froze through overnight and became covered with frost on the inside. The sleeping area was always located closer to the center of the room or opposite the hearth, but at a safe distance from sparks. This created a zone of relatively warm air circulating inside the room around the bed. The height of the bed was also critical. The higher it was from the floor, the warmer it was. Cold air, being heavy, accumulated near the floor, where the temperature could be below zero, even if the stove was burning in the room. The base of the bed was often made of rope, with tight ropes woven into a net. These ropes had to be tightened regularly with a special wooden wrench to prevent the net from sagging. A sagging bed caused the bodies of those sleeping to slide into a heap, which, however, was sometimes an advantage for retaining heat. A mattress was placed on the rope net, which was itself a miracle of insulation. Mattresses were stuffed not just with hay, but with specially prepared materials. Corn leaves were considered the best filler because they were stiff, but created an excellent air layer. Straw was also used, but it quickly became crumpled and required frequent replacement and fluffing. Wealthy families could afford goose-down duvets, which were the ultimate in thermal insulation. The duvet worked by trapping the air heated by the body inside millions of fluffy feathers. A person literally sank into it, surrounded by a warm cocoon on all sides, not just from above. However, the down had to be protected from moisture, as a wet duvet lost all its properties and began to rot. Flannel sheets were laid on top of the mattress, rather than cold linen or cotton. Flannel, thanks to its pile, was pleasant to the touch and immediately gave a feeling of warmth. Linen sheets in an icy room felt like a sheet of metal and could take away precious body heat in the first minutes of sleep. A mountain of quilted blankets, sewn from scraps of old clothes and wool, was piled on top of the sleepers. These patchwork quilts were heavy and dense, creating a reliable barrier. The heavier the blanket, the less likely a person was to accidentally uncover themselves in their sleep. The final layer was often a bison or bear skin, placed with the fur facing inwards or outwards, depending on preference. Bison skin was incredibly heavy, but it had a fantastic ability to trap heat. It was difficult to move under such weight, but it guaranteed that the layer of air around the body remained still. Sometimes a canopy of thick fabric was erected over the bed, creating a kind of room within a room. This canopy trapped the breath of those sleeping, slightly raising the temperature directly in the sleeping area. In the morning, frost could form on the inside of the canopy from the condensation of breath. Do you think it is comfortable to sleep under a weight exceeding 20 kilograms? Share your opinion in the comments. Could you fall asleep in such conditions? What I'm about to show you was the only way to get heat right into your bed. When the fire in the hearth died down in the middle of the night, the only source of heat left was preheated objects. Pioneers used the principle of stone heat capacity, turning ordinary cobblestones into long-lasting heaters. In the evening, large soapstones, bricks, or even cast iron irons were placed on the hearth or in the stove. Soapstone, steatite, was especially valued because it could retain heat for hours, slowly releasing it into the surrounding space. These batteries heated up to such an extent that it was impossible to touch them with bare hands. Before placing the stone in bed, it was carefully wrapped in several layers of old flannel or woolen fabric. This was done so as not to burn the bedding or the sleeper's feet. The fabric also regulated heat transfer, making it softer and more even. The hot bundle was placed at the foot of the bed a few minutes before going to sleep. This allowed the icy space under the blanket to warm up, making the process of getting into bed less painful. The feet, as the most vulnerable part of the body to the cold, received a powerful source of heat for the first half of the night. In the absence of stones, bags of heated salt, sand, or grain, such as cherry pits, were used. Such warmers were softer and more comfortable, taking the shape of the body, but they cooled faster than massive stones. Potatoes baked in their skins were also often placed in pajama pockets or simply in the bed. The potato retained its heat for a long time, and in the morning it could be eaten, even though it was already cold. This was an example of the waste-free use of resources characteristic of frontier life. The use of metal objects, such as boiler lids, required special care. Metal cooled faster than stone and could cause serious burns if skin accidentally came into contact with the hot surface. Therefore, metal hot water bottles were always placed in thick knitted covers or old woolen socks. For children, large pieces of hardwood were sometimes heated. Wood did not retain heat as well as stone, but it was safer and lighter, which was important if the child tossed and turned in their sleep. In the wealthiest homes, there might be special copper hot water bottles with long handles, which were filled with coals from the stove. They were used to iron the sheets before bedtime, but they could not be left in bed because of the risk of fire and carbon monoxide poisoning. The whole family participated in the evening ritual of preparing the batteries. Someone looked for stones, someone monitored their heating. Forgetting to heat the bricks meant condemning yourself to a sleepless night with cold feet. This simple physics of heat transfer was the only technology for comfort available in the wild wilderness. But heating the bed was not enough. You also had to dress properly. Want to know why pioneers never slept naked? Don't forget to like if you enjoy historical details like this. Are you ready to learn the truth about what pioneers actually wore to bed? The idea of sleeping in light pajamas or no clothes at all would have been considered madness by the settlers and a sure way to freeze. Nightwear was an extension of daytime clothing, and often it was not taken off at all, with only new layers added. The basis of the night wardrobe was red flannel or wool underwear, the famous long johns. This jumpsuit covered the entire body from the ankles to the wrists and fit snugly against the skin, keeping it warm. There was no point in taking it off at night when it was minus 50 degrees, and changing clothes in an icy room was torture. Over the underwear, they wore a long nightgown made of thick fabric that reached to the feet. The air trapped between the layers of clothing acted as an additional insulator, similar to modern multi-layer hiking systems. Women wore several petticoats, even at night, to create a voluminous cocoon around their legs. Special attention was paid to the head, as this is where a significant amount of heat is lost. Nightcaps were a must-have for both men and women, and this was not a fashion statement. Men's caps were long, conical in shape, often with a tassel, and could be pulled down over the ears. Women wore thick bonnets that were tied under the chin to ensure that the headdress did not slip off during sleep. Leaving your head uncovered meant waking up with a severe headache or catching a cold that could lead to serious inflammation. The neck was often wrapped in an old woolen scarf or shawl, covering the vulnerable throat area. Thick woolen socks were worn on the feet, often 2 pairs at once. Knitted socks made of coarse sheep's wool not only kept the feet warm, but also stimulated blood circulation with their tingling sensation. The feet were the weakest point, and if they froze, it was impossible to warm up. Hands were hidden under a blanket, but sometimes mittens were worn if the temperature in the house dropped below 0. Clothes had to be loose so as not to constrict blood vessels and disrupt blood flow. Tight clothing, on the contrary, accelerated the freezing of the extremities. In the morning, this multi-layered cocoon allowed them to get out from under the blanket and start the day without experiencing the shock of contact with the frosty air. Changing clothes, if necessary, was done quickly, often right under the blanket. Sleepwear was often dried by the fire before being put on to remove the slightest traces of moisture. Moisture was the enemy. Damp fabric instantly drew heat from the body. All this layering turned a person into a clumsy but cold-protected character. Comfort was sacrificed for survival, but even the warmest clothes could not save you if the house cooled down too quickly. In the next chapter, you will learn how the pioneers insulated their homes with old newspapers. The walls of pioneer huts, whether log or frame houses, were rarely perfect. The wood dried out, gaps appeared between the logs, and the wind blew out precious heat. In the fall, a large-scale operation to seal the dwelling began, in which all family members participated. The main process was caulking, filling the gaps between the logs with a mixture of clay, dirt, and moss. This mixture was kneaded with feet or sticks, adding straw or animal wool for strength. As it hardened, it turned into a solid plug that reliably blocked the wind. The inside of the walls was often covered with several layers of old newspapers using a paste made from flour and water. Despite its thinness, the paper created an excellent wind barrier and covered micro cracks. Reading 3-year-old news on the walls was a common bedtime entertainment for many frontier children. Wealthier families hung carpets, blankets, or skins on the walls, creating so-called tapestries. The fabric on the wall acted as additional insulation, blocking the cold coming from the logs. It also improved the acoustics, making the house cozier and quieter. Door and window openings were the main sources of heat loss, so they were covered with heavy curtains or blankets. A sausage, a long bag filled with sand or sawdust, was placed at the bottom of the door to cover the gap at the threshold. The attic, if there was one, was covered with a thick layer of dry leaves, sawdust, or hay. Heat rises, and without an insulated ceiling, it would simply escape through the roof, melting the snow. The floors, especially if they were planked and raised above the ground, were covered with whatever was at hand. They used woven rugs made of rags, old sacks, and even layers of straw, which were changed once a week. A high mound of earth or manure was piled around the foundation of the house to insulate the subfloor. This method, known as zavalinka, prevented the floor from freezing from below. All these measures turned the house into an airtight capsule, where every cubic centimeter of warm air counted. The fight against drafts was a never-ending war that was waged every day. Guess what was the most dangerous enemy of a sleeping person after the cold? It was carbon monoxide and the risk of fire coming from the only source of life, the hearth. Controlling fire at night was an art that required experience and intuition. The stove or fireplace could not simply be left burning at full power. The wood burned quickly, and by morning the house would be cold. Therefore, at night the fire was banked. The coals were raked into a pile and covered with a thick layer of ash. The ashes blocked the oxygen supply, causing the coals to smolder slowly rather than burn, retaining their heat until morning. In the morning, it was enough to rake the ashes, add a little kindling, and the fire would flare up again without matches. Matches were an expensive commodity, and losing the fire was considered a disaster. On the coldest nights, a person was assigned to be on duty who had to get up every hour and check the hearth. Wood, which was scarce on the plains, was not the only fuel used. The pioneers burned bison chips, dried bison dung, which burned slowly and gave off an even heat. They also used tightly twisted bundles of hay, which were called cattails. The twisted hay burned quickly, but gave off an intense burst of heat, which was useful for warming up quickly before bedtime. The danger was that if the draft was wrong, carbon monoxide could enter the room. In a tightly sealed house, this would mean certain death for the entire family. Therefore, despite the cold, it was sometimes necessary to leave a microscopic gap in the chimney damper. This was a compromise between preserving heat and being able to breathe. The chimney was cleaned regularly, as soot could catch fire and cause a roof fire. A fire in winter in the steppe meant death, as running out into the cold without clothes or shelter was tantamount to death. Water in buckets often froze, and there was simply nothing to extinguish the fire with. Metal potbelly stoves, which appeared later, gave off a lot of heat but cooled down instantly. They were surrounded by stones to prolong the heat transfer in some way. The hearth was the heart of the home, capricious and demanding, on which life depended. In the next chapter, you will learn how the pioneers used food as internal fuel. External heat was not enough to survive a cold night, because even the hottest hearth could not warm the entire house. The pioneers needed to start powerful internal heating so as not to freeze in the morning. They intuitively understood the principles of metabolism, even though they didn't know such fancy words. People at that time were well aware that food was the main fuel for the human body. Without proper refueling, this fuel would simply burn out by the middle of the night. Dinner on frosty winter days was a very special ritual that was taken very seriously. The food on the table had to be as high in calories, heavy, and very fatty as possible. Light snacks were not suitable here because they could not provide long-lasting protection from the cold. Lean food did not provide enough energy for continuous heat production during the long winter night. If a person ate only lean meat or vegetables, they risked waking up shivering long before dawn. Therefore, before going to bed, they tried to eat something with an extremely high fat content. This was not a whim, but a harsh necessity for survival. Most often, dinner consisted of salted lard or a large piece of fatty pork, which was chewed thoroughly. Sometimes it was a piece of coarse bread, thickly spread with lard or bear fat. The thicker the layer of spread, the more peacefully a person slept. Fats have the property of being digested very slowly, providing the body with energy for many hours of sleep. It's like a thick log in a stove that smolders all night and keeps the fire from going out. This complex digestive process itself generated significant internal heat, warming the person from within. A hungry person froze much faster than a full one, and the pioneers knew this from bitter experience. When the stomach is empty, the metabolism slows down to conserve resources, and the body stops fighting the cold. Therefore, going to bed on an empty stomach in winter was life-threatening. Hot drinks before bedtime were another proven way to raise body temperature before getting under the covers. People usually drank strong herbal teas made from whatever they had gathered during the summer. They often brewed surrogate coffee from roasted beans, chicory, or roots, which was hot and aromatic. In extreme cases, people would simply drink boiling water to warm their insides. If there were supplies in the house, sugar or thick molasses would always be added to the mug. These were fast carbohydrates that had an instant warming effect, acting like kindling for a fire. Contrary to popular belief, people tried not to drink alcohol before bed in a severe frost. Experienced frontier dwellers knew that alcohol only gave a false and deceptive feeling of warmth. It quickly dilates the blood vessels, and blood rushes to the skin, creating the illusion of heat. In reality, at this moment, the body rapidly loses precious heat, giving it off to the cold air. A drunk person could fall asleep in a snowdrift or a cold room and simply not feel the danger. They did not notice their feet or hands freezing, which often led to tragedy. A special dish was prepared for children so that they could sleep peacefully until morning in the warmth. It was hot porridge made with milk, most often from corn flour. Butter or fat was generously added to this porridge if there was no butter. This hearty dish was called mush and was the main source of energy for growing bodies during the winter. Children enjoyed eating it because it gave them a feeling of fullness and comfort. Food in those days was not just a way to satisfy hunger or enjoy oneself. It was a strategic resource for survival, as important as firewood or gunpowder. Food supplies were stored wisely so that they would not freeze completely and spoil. Although frost served as an excellent natural preservative, it also created certain difficulties. Food had to be placed in specific areas of the house or outbuildings. Meat could be stored all winter without spoiling, which was a big plus for the household. However, cutting the right piece for dinner from a thoroughly frozen carcass was no easy task. An axe or saw had to be used to obtain food from one's own supplies. The water in the house often turned to ice overnight, even if the coals were still smoldering in the hearth. Therefore, in the evening, a bucket of water was placed as close to the heat as possible. This ensured that in the morning, there would be at least a little liquid water for washing or drinking. Sometimes housewives used an old trick and put a piece of clean wood in the bucket of water. This was done so that when the ice expanded as it froze, it would not break the wooden bucket. The piece of wood took the pressure on itself, saving the valuable container. The eating habits of frontier dwellers may seem wild and unhealthy to modern people. The abundance of fat, fried foods, and flour is now considered harmful. But in conditions of extreme cold and hard physical labor, cholesterol was the least of their problems. Fat was life itself, providing energy for the daily struggle against the bitter cold. People burned these calories without residue, simply trying to keep warm and doing housework. Thus, a spoonful of lard before bed was as reliable a form of protection as a thick woolen blanket. In the bitter cold, when the walls of the house were frozen through, the very concept of personal space ceased to exist. People quickly forgot about modesty and distance, As the frost dictated its harsh conditions, the pioneers instantly remembered the ancient survival instinct that caused living creatures to huddle together in a tight group. They understood that it was impossible to withstand the elements alone. It was incredibly difficult for a single person to survive at -50 degrees, and their chances of seeing the dawn were close to zero. A person sleeping alone lost heat too quickly, and no amount of blankets could compensate for this loss. Meanwhile, a group of people who pooled their resources had a much better chance of surviving the night. Collective warmth became their main lifeline. Sleeping with the whole family in one large bed was not a sign of poverty or lack of furniture, but a harsh necessity. Even if there were other rooms and beds in the house, they were empty in winter. All the inhabitants of the house gathered in one place to create a single center of warmth. This method was called bundling, or in simple terms, huddling together. Parents and children lay down in bed, huddling together as closely as possible, literally side by side. They exchanged the warmth of their bodies, creating a closed circuit within which life was preserved. Blankets and skins were thrown on top in several layers, sealing the precious warm air inside. Under this common shelter, the temperature was significantly higher than in the room itself. If there were a lot of children in the family, they were laid out in a special way, which was called a jack. This meant that one child's head lay next to another's feet, and so on, down the line. This arrangement allowed all the members of a large family to fit on one mattress without the risk of anyone falling off. It was a forced but effective Tetris-like survival system. This arrangement also allowed them to warm their perpetually cold feet against the warm shoulders or sides of their neighbors. In conditions of heat shortage, every square centimeter of warm body was put to good use. No one complained about the cramped conditions or uncomfortable positions, because in those circumstances, cramped conditions meant life and warmth. A spacious bed in winter was perceived as an icy trap. Dogs have a higher body temperature than humans, and were excellent at warming the space around them. Their thick fur and hot breath contributed to the overall microclimate of the sleeping area. People were grateful to their pets for this warmth and tolerated the smell of dogs for the sake of survival. Dogs, in turn, were also saved from certain death on the streets. Guests or random travelers caught in a blizzard on the road were also invited into the communal bed. If there was not enough room in the bed, they would lie close to their hosts on the floor, on spread-out skins. Rules of propriety and moral norms gave way in the face of real mortal danger. No one thought about whether it was proper to sleep next to a stranger. To refuse a traveler warmth on such a night meant effectively condemning him to death with your own hands. The laws of hospitality on the frontier were sacred and written in blood. People understood that tomorrow they themselves could find themselves in the place of this freezing stranger. Mutual assistance was the basis of existence in the wildlands. The hardest moment came in the morning, when it was necessary to climb out of this cozy, warm nest into the icy room. Usually one person did this first, most often the father of the family or the eldest son. He had to show real willpower to throw off the blanket. He quickly got dressed, his teeth chattering from the cold, and ran to the stove. The head of the family would heat up the stove by blowing on the coals or rekindling the fire with wood. The rest of the family would stay under the blankets, waiting for the temperature in the house to rise by at least a couple of degrees. Only when the air warmed up a little and thick steam stopped coming out of their mouths would the rest leave their shelter. The day began with a struggle to restore warmth to the home. The collective warmth of their bodies was the most reliable, renewable, and completely free resource. It could not be taken away, stolen, or lost as long as people were alive. It saved them even in the most critical moments when the firewood or coal ran out. When the stones heated up in the evening cooled down, the living warmth remained the last line of defense. This practice of sleeping together was not limited to the poor who were trying to save fuel. Even in well-off families with large houses, everyone gathered in one room during periods of extreme cold. In the face of the great cold, everyone was equal, and nature dictated the same rules for all. The paradox of harsh life on the frontier lay in a surprising fact. Snow, being a cold substance, could be the best insulation for a home. At first glance, it seemed crazy to cover a house with something that causes frostbite. However, the pioneers quickly learned to observe nature itself, which does not forgive mistakes. They watched closely how wild animals behaved during blizzards. People noticed that animals did not run away from the snow, but instead burrowed deep into the snow drifts to survive the frosty night. Partridges, hares, and even bears used the snow cover as a blanket. Settlers began to use this simple but ingenious principle to protect their homes. When the first heavy snowfall began, the owners of the house went outside with shovels. Instead of completely clearing the perimeter of the house down to the ground, they did the exact opposite. They deliberately raked the snow into large piles and threw it directly onto the log walls. These man-made snowdrifts could reach the window frames, and sometimes they were piled even higher, up to the roof. As a result, the house turned into something resembling an Eskimo igloo or a large snow hill with a chimney. This changed the appearance of the dwelling, but saved the lives of its inhabitants. The secret of such protection lay in the physical properties of frozen water, which the pioneers intuitively guessed. Snow has a porous structure and contains a huge amount of air between the snowflakes. And still air, as we know, is a very poor conductor of heat and serves as an excellent insulator. Such a thick snow coat reliably protected the house from the piercing, icy wind of the prairies. It was the wind that was often more frightening than the frost itself, as it instantly cooled the room. It blew precious heat out of the smallest cracks between the logs, which could not always be properly caulked. A layer of thick snow completely blocked the wind's access to the walls of the house. Inside the snow-covered dwelling, it became noticeably quieter as the snow muffled the sounds of the storm. Most importantly, it became much warmer, and significantly less firewood was needed for the stove. They also tried to throw an extra layer of snow on the roof, if the structure of the house allowed it. Since heat always rises, most of it was lost through the ceiling. The snow cap helped to keep the heated air inside the room. However, extreme caution and moderation were required here. The main thing was to make sure that the wooden beams of the floors did not sag under the weight of the precipitation. If there was too much snow, the roof could collapse right on top of sleeping people, leading to tragedy. To move around the yard, the pioneers dug deep tunnels in the snow. These passages led only to strategically important objects: farm buildings, a barn with livestock, and a toilet. The walls in such corridors could be taller than a person. These snow trenches also provided excellent protection from the wind when moving from the house to the barn. Sometimes the snow at the base of the walls was deliberately watered and tamped down. This created a solid ice shell that was not blown away by the wind and served as an additional shield. However, in the spring, this life-saving winter strategy turned into a serious problem. The snow melting under the spring sun threatened to flood the house as the water flowed directly under the doors. Considering that the floor in most huts was earthen, the dwelling could turn into a swamp. Snow was also actively used in the household to store perishable foods. Meat from hunted game was often buried directly in thick snowdrifts near the house. It was an excellent natural refrigerator that worked for free and did not require electricity. Snow was also the only source of water if the well froze or was completely covered by snow. Clean snow was collected in buckets and melted on the stove to obtain water for drinking and washing. People's attitude towards snow ranged from fear of the elements to pragmatic use of its properties. It was a true philosophy of survival in the wild. The pioneers learned their lesson. What does not kill you should help you survive if you find the right approach. People did not fight nature, but adapted to it. The use of snow insulation was widespread across vast territories from Dakota to Alaska. This method of insulation did not cost the settlers a penny. It only required hard physical labor with a shovel after each snowfall. In this way, the pioneers literally covered their homes with a thick blanket of snow, just as they covered themselves with woolen blankets in bed. The most difficult and painful ordeal for the frontier residents was not the long night itself, but the moment of morning awakening. Morning in a house at a temperature of -50 degrees began with overcoming physical pain and severe discomfort. The walls of the dwelling froze so much during the night that the air inside cooled to sub-zero temperatures. The water in the mugs turned to ice, and the breath of the sleeping people hung in the air like thick fog. Each breath burned the lungs with cold, reminding them that the protection of the blanket was temporary. The steam from their mouths came out in such thick clouds that it seemed as if someone was smoking in the room. The head of the family, or the person whose turn it was to stoke the stove that morning, was always the first to wake up. This person had to summon incredible willpower to force themselves to move. Climbing out from under a mountain of warm, heated blankets into the icy cold of the room was a real feat. The body was instantly overcome by chills, and every movement was difficult due to muscle stiffness. The clothes that had been taken off in the evening and left on a chair became stiff as oak overnight from the cold. Putting on such clothes was painfully unpleasant. The fabric seemed to be made of tin and scratched the skin. The water in the bucket, prepared in the evening for washing, often froze to the bottom, turning into a monolith. To get even a little liquid, the ice had to be chopped with an axe or melted over a fire for a long time. There was no question of washing properly in such conditions. People limited themselves to quickly wiping their faces and hands with ice water or snow just to wake up. Toothbrushes, if the family had any, often stood in a glass, frozen solid in the ice. They had to wait until the heat of the stove freed them from their icy captivity. The windows were covered on the inside with a thick layer of bizarre ice patterns, sometimes as thick as a finger. Nothing could be seen through them, and the house was in semi-darkness even after sunrise. This hard ice had to be scraped off with a knife for a long time just to see if dawn had already broken. It was also necessary to simply look outside and assess the situation in the yard before going out. Metal objects in the house posed a particular danger. Door handles and bolts were burning cold, and it was easy to stick to them with wet hands, tearing the skin. Starting a fire was the most critical moment of the entire morning, on which the health of the family depended. If the firewood had gotten wet overnight or the coals in the hearth had completely gone out, the morning turned into a desperate struggle for life. With frozen, stiff fingers that did not obey at all, it was necessary to strike a spark. Sometimes it took a long time and persistent blowing on a tiny smoldering ember, hoping that it would catch fire. Any mistake here could be costly as the house continued to cool down. The sound of crackling fire and the smell of smoke were the most welcome sensations at the beginning of the day. Only when the stove began to hum and give off its first life-giving warmth did the rest of the family wake up. The children tried to get dressed right in bed without climbing out from under the shared blanket. This allowed them to retain at least a little body heat and not freeze completely while they pulled on their pants. The women often prepared breakfast while still wearing their winter coats and warm hats. They only took off their outer clothing when the room had warmed up to a comfortable temperature. At this time of day, the kitchen resembled a polar expedition camp rather than a cozy family home. Boots, carelessly left on the floor the night before, shrank and hardened like stone overnight. The leather froze so much that it was impossible to put the shoes on. They had to be kneaded with their hands for a long time and with great effort to restore the material's flexibility. Boots were often placed by the fire to warm up, but care had to be taken to ensure that they did not burn. Resourceful pioneers sometimes used stones heated in the oven, which they placed inside the shoes. This helped to soften the leather from the inside and made the process of putting on the shoes less painful. Going outside to tend to the livestock was the next mandatory stage of the daily feat. Opening the front door, a person let a huge cloud of frosty steam into the house, which spread ominously across the floor. But there was no choice as the farm depended on the animals. The cattle in the barn also needed warmth and food, and caring for them was more important than the farmer's own comfort. If the livestock died, the family would not survive the winter, so people went through the blizzard to the barn. Each such morning was a small but important victory of man over the harsh nature. It was a difficult routine for real heroes who did not consider themselves to be such. They simply lived their lives and did what they had to do for their families. The ability to get up, light a fire, and start a new day in the icy wilderness was the main quality of a pioneer. The survival of the pioneers in extreme cold was not a miracle, but the result of hard work, ingenuity, and iron discipline. Every detail of their daily life, from the filling of their mattresses to the construction of their dugouts, was dictated by the need to preserve precious heat. They did not fight nature, but adapted to it, using its laws to their advantage. These people slept in conditions that would seem like torture to us today, and at the same time built a new civilization. Their experience reminds us of the fragility of human life and the incredible strength of spirit that can warm even at -50 degrees. Which of these survival methods did you find most inventive? Could you spend even one night in such conditions? Suggest topics for future videos about life in the past in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories.